Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. I've been sitting on this for a while, trying to find the right words. If you've ever lived in a new place, you know the feeling. Everything seems fresh and exciting at first. But when the shine wears off, things start to feel a little less perfect, a little real. And that's what happened to me. My husband and I had just moved to California a couple of months ago. He got this amazing job offer in Silicon Valley, and we thought, why not? The house we bought wasn't much, just an old, quirky place in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't the mansion of our dreams, but it had character. It was the kind of house you could make your own, and that's what we planned to do. But that was before things started getting weird. It all started with the sink. It wasn't a big issue, just a clogged kitchen sink. I figured it was probably just a buildup of grease or food scraps. No big deal, right? So I Googled a local plumber and found a guy who seemed to have good reviews. He said he could come over that afternoon, and I didn't see any reason to delay. The sooner it was fixed, the sooner I could get back to my life. He showed up just as I was starting to think I'd been stood up. The guy was tall, maybe in his 40s, wearing a loose shirt with grease stains on the sleeves and a pair of well-worn jeans. His name was Greg. I shook his hand when he stepped through the door. His grip was firm, but there was something about his handshake that didn't sit right. It wasn't overly aggressive, but it lingered just a second longer than necessary, like he was sizing me up. "Hey there, I'm Greg," he said, giving me a quick, tight smile. "Hi," I said, trying to sound friendly. "The sink's in the kitchen." He nodded and walked toward the back of the house without waiting for me to guide him. The guy didn't seem to care much for pleasantries. I thought maybe he was just focused on his work, but looking back, I think it was more than that. As he got to work, I found myself standing in the kitchen, watching him move around. He wasn't hasty. In fact, it felt like he was taking his time. He'd turn a wrench slowly, listen to the sound of the pipes, and then stop to stare at the ceiling like he was trying to figure something out. I tried to break the silence. "So, how long have you been doing plumbing?" I asked, hoping to make small talk. Greg didn't immediately answer. He just kept working, humming under his breath. After a long pause, he looked up at me and said, "Been doing it for years, ever since I was a kid. My dad taught me." I smiled. "That's cool. I'm sure you've seen it all." He just nodded, not really engaging. It wasn't until he got deeper into the pipes that the conversation took a strange turn. "You know," he said, almost like he was thinking out loud. "Old houses have their secrets." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He didn't look up from his work, but I could tell he was thinking about how to phrase his words carefully. "Houses like this one, they have history. Sometimes people leave things behind, things they don't want to talk about, things that stay." He paused, then added, "You feel safe here?" I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. The question threw me off. Yeah, I mean, it's fine. We haven't had any issues so far." Greg glanced up at me, his eyes sharp and piercing, as if he was evaluating my response. "That's good," he said slowly. "Real good." Then, just as quickly, he went back to fiddling with the pipes, as though the conversation was over. The whole thing made me uncomfortable, and I couldn't understand why. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, or maybe it was the way he kept making odd, cryptic comments. It was like he was trying to dig into something, but I wasn't sure what. As Greg continued working, I tried to distract myself by doing something else in the kitchen, but I couldn't stop noticing how slowly he moved. It was as if he was savoring the job, drawing it out for as long as possible. He was meticulous, but it felt like there was an underlying tension to his actions, like he was studying the space around him, rather than simply fixing a sink. "Do you ever go out at night?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I froze for a moment. "What?" He looked up again, his face expressionless. "I just mean for walks, or to explore the area. You ever do that?" I shook my head, a little taken aback. "Not really. I mean, we've only been here a couple months. I don't know the area that well." Greg said, almost as if he expected me to answer differently. He gave a slight nod, like he understood something I didn't. He returned to the sink, his fingers working over the pipes with precise, deliberate movements. The odd questions kept coming after that, but I tried to brush them off. He was just being friendly, I thought. He had to be. But the more he asked, the more unsettled I became. At one point, he even asked me if I had any pets. "Pets are nice," he said. "Makes the house feel more alive. You know, like you're not alone in it." I felt a cold shiver run through me. It was such a strange thing to say, especially when the house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. But I smiled politely and told him we didn't have pets, just to end the conversation. Finally, after what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 2, he finished with the sink. He wiped his hands on a rag and stood up, stretching his back. He glanced around the kitchen, then looked me square in the eyes. He said with a finality that made me feel something. Uneasy. "Thanks," I said, handing him a check. He took the check without a word, but instead of leaving right away, he lingered by the door. He stood there, looking at me for what felt like too long. I was about to ask if he needed anything else when he spoke again, his voice low. "You really ought to lock your windows at night," he said, as if he were giving me a friendly piece of advice. His eyes didn't leave mine. "Excuse me?" I asked, not sure if I'd heard him right. "I'm just saying," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "You never know who might be out there." He didn't smile this time. His face was as serious as I'd ever seen it. I felt a sudden, uncomfortable lump in my throat. "Okay, thanks," I said, trying to brush it off, but it wasn't working. Greg didn't seem in any rush to leave. In fact, he stood there for another moment, still looking at me with that same odd, penetrating stare. Finally, he turned and left. But before he did, he added one last thing. "You're going to want to lock those windows. Trust me." I didn't know how to respond. My heart was beating a little too fast as I closed the door behind him. Why did he say that? It didn't make sense. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about it. The evening started like any other. I made dinner, cleaned up, and then went to bed. My husband, Jason, was working late, so I was alone. As I lay in bed, I tried to relax, but something was off. I kept thinking about Greg's words. "Lock your windows at night." I knew I should probably get some sleep, but every little sound felt louder than usual. The creaks of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, everything seemed amplified. I eventually drifted off, but I wasn't comfortable. I kept having this nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. Then around 2 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The house was old, and old houses creak. But then I heard it again. Louder this time. Slow, deliberate steps, one after another. My heart started pounding, my chest tightening as I realized the footsteps were coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I froze. The footsteps paused, and I held my breath, hoping the sound would go away. But it didn't. Instead, I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place. Then it stopped. The door handle remained still, but I knew something was wrong. There was someone out there. I could feel it. I could hear the faintest sounds of breathing through the door, ragged and slow, as if whoever was on the other side was waiting for me to make a move. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. I whispered into the phone, "Someone's in my house. Please help." Just as I finished speaking, I heard a door creak down the hall. The footsteps began again, and I realized whoever it was, they weren't just walking through the house. They were looking for something. I moved quietly, inching toward the window, praying the person wouldn't hear me. My hands were slick with sweat as I fumbled with the blinds. I couldn't help but glance toward the hallway, terrified of what I might see. And that's when I saw him. Standing at the end of the hall, Greg was looking at me. His dark eyes locked onto mine, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring. "Greg?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The next few moments felt like they were happening in slow motion, but my brain was operating at hyperspeed. I could barely process what was happening, only that I was in immediate danger and I needed to get away. As Greg's heavy footsteps drew nearer, I did the only thing I could think to do. I bolted. My heart was thundering in my chest, and the blood rushing in my ears drowned out everything else. I ran down the hallway, my legs feeling like lead as I sprinted past the small living room, the air around me thick with tension and the faint smell of grease and metal from his tools still lingering in the air. I could hear Greg behind me, his slow, deliberate footsteps getting louder with each passing second, as if he were enjoying the chase. Panic overtook me, and my mind went blank. My first instinct was to get out of the house, to get to safety. I wasn't thinking straight, just running. But as I reached the front door, my hands fumbled with the lock, slick with sweat and terror. It felt like the door was mocking me, taking forever to open, and I had this sickening feeling that Greg was right on my heels, his breath hot on my neck. Then, just as I was about to turn the knob, I felt something grab my wrist. Hard. I screamed, a gut-wrenching, desperate cry that seemed to echo through the empty house. The force of it shocked me, but the man's grip was unyielding. He was stronger than I thought, his fingers digging into my skin. The pain made me gasp, but I refused to give up. I kicked backward, flailing wildly, and hit him in the shin with my knee, but it barely fazed him. He pulled me back toward him, his breath a mix of exertion and something else, something colder. "Let go of me," I screamed, but my voice barely sounded human, just a raw, frantic plea. I struggled harder, using everything I had in me to break free. I dug my nails into his arm, tearing at his skin. For a moment, I thought I might lose the fight. Then, in a last burst of strength, I twisted my arm out of his grip, feeling his fingers slip away. It was like a moment of clarity amid the chaos. He let go. I didn't hesitate. I ran. My feet pounded against the wooden floors as I sprinted toward the kitchen, my mind racing for something, anything, that might protect me. There, on the counter, was a long kitchen knife. I grabbed it with shaking hands, feeling its cold steel against my palm. It wasn't much, but it was something. I wasn't going down without a fight, but the reality of what was happening still hadn't fully hit me. Greg was still in the house, and the knife felt inadequate. It wasn't just a repairman anymore. It wasn't just some guy working on a sink. I felt a terrifying shift in the air. He was hunting me now. I turned back toward the front door, nearly tripping in my haste to reach it. I yanked the door open, flinging myself into the night air. I slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I could hardly hear anything else. And then, finally, I heard the sirens. The police arrived in what felt like an eternity. They took my statement and searched the house, finding no sign of Greg. I told them everything I could remember, but Greg was gone by the time the officers arrived. They searched the neighborhood, knocked on nearby doors, but they couldn't find him. He was smart, though. He'd slipped out unnoticed, blending into the night. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed up, every creak and crack of the house making me jump, each shadow on the walls making my heart race. I kept the lights on. I kept the doors locked. It was a week before I got any real answers. They found Greg, finally. He had a criminal record, though nothing to this extent. I tried to move on, tried to convince myself that it was over. But there are some things you can't forget. I want to preface this by saying I'm not a writer, not even close. So if this story seems a little rough around the edges, please bear with me. But I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and I feel like it's something that needs to be shared, even if I'm not great at telling it. I'm hoping that by writing it down, I can get some closure or at least put it behind me, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. This event still creeps me out whenever I think about it. It happened about 6 months ago, but it's one of those things that stays with you. I'm from California, and my husband, Mark, and I had just moved into a new house. It wasn't anything too fancy, just a simple 3-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood, one of those suburban areas where you don't expect anything crazy to happen. We had been renting for years, so when we bought this house, it felt like the next big step in our lives, something we had worked so hard for. It felt like a fresh start, a new chapter. Things were normal at first. We spent the first few weeks settling in, unpacking boxes, and getting used to the layout of the house. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly families, retirees, and the occasional jogger. There wasn't much noise, and the air always smelled like fresh pine from the trees lining the streets. It felt safe, peaceful. I thought nothing could go wrong. But then, something happened that turned my whole perception of that safety upside down. It started one afternoon, about 2 weeks after we moved in. Mark had already left for work, and I was home alone. I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to finish up some paperwork, when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was maybe a delivery had arrived or a neighbor needed something. It wasn't uncommon for people to stop by in the neighborhood, so I wasn't too alarmed. I got up from the table, walked through the hallway, and glanced out the front window to see who it was. There was a man standing on the porch. He wasn't overly tall, maybe a few inches shorter than Mark. He had a clipboard in his hand. He didn't exactly look like someone I'd expect to see in the neighborhood, but he didn't seem threatening either. He looked like one of those utility workers, just an ordinary guy, doing his job. So I opened the door. "Hello, ma'am. I'm Steve from the water department," he said, his voice sounding almost too calm. "We're doing some routine maintenance in the area, and I need to check your pipes inside the house." Now, I wasn't an expert in these things, but that seemed a little odd. I didn't recall getting any notice or anything in the mail about a water inspection, but at the same time, I didn't really think much of it. Sometimes these things happen without warning. Utilities are unpredictable, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to let him check. He looked professional enough, and it was just a simple check, right? I was still a little hesitant, but he showed me the clipboard, which had some sort of official-looking paper attached to it. The logo on the top was blurry and faded, but I figured it was legitimate. The uniform he was wearing didn't seem out of place either. Dark blue shirt, a name tag that was hard to read, but still looked authentic enough. In retrospect, I probably should have been more suspicious, but everything seemed fine at the time. I let him in. Steve asked me to lead him to the water meter, which was located in the utility closet near the back of the house. I thought that made sense, so I took him down the hallway and into the small closet. It was a cramped space, but there was a single light bulb overhead, and I could see the water meter clearly from where I stood. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, which I found strange. Most of the time, workers are in and out, especially if it's just a routine check. But Steve was methodical, and he took his time, examining the meter as though it was the most important thing he had ever seen. What made me uneasy, though, was how much he was looking at me. It wasn't like a casual glance or an awkward, brief look. No, this was different. His eyes kept darting toward me as he fiddled with the meter, like he was studying me rather than working. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking I was just being paranoid, but the longer he stood there, the more it started to bug me. His eyes would meet mine for a few seconds, then quickly shift back to the meter, only to come back to me again. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't just a glance. It felt purposeful, like he was sizing me up. It made my skin crawl. He wasn't paying attention to what he was supposed to be doing. He was watching me. And that made no sense at all. Why wasn't he focused on his job? After a few moments of this, I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Not a lot, but enough for me to see. He wasn't shaking violently, but there was a slight quiver in his fingers as he twisted the valve on the meter. It wasn't normal. It was like he was nervous, or maybe pretending to be busy so I wouldn't notice how uncomfortable he really was. I tried to brush it off. I didn't want to seem rude, but I kept feeling like something wasn't right. Maybe I was just being paranoid. It wasn't like I had ever dealt with a water department worker before, so I had no idea how they were supposed to act. But this guy, Steve, seemed different. Something about him felt off. He asked to check the pipes in the bathroom next. I didn't know why he needed to go to the bathroom. After all, he was already at the water meter, which was right by the utility closet. But he insisted. I figured maybe there was something else he had to check, so I led him to the hallway bathroom. As we walked through the house, I noticed more strange things. Steve didn't really look at the bathroom, at least not in the way you'd expect someone checking for leaks or issues to look. Instead, he kept his eyes on me. Every time I turned to grab something from the cabinet or check the pipes, I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck. It was unsettling. I went to check the sink under the cabinet, trying to avoid his stare, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was hard to explain, like the hairs on my arms were standing up. I didn't feel safe. I didn't know what it was, but I had this nagging sense that something was wrong. Then, without warning, he asked me about my husband. "So your husband's home today?" Steve asked casually, still not really looking at the pipes or anything else. "No," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "He's at work. He's usually home late." He nodded as if filing that away in his mind, but it felt so unnatural. Why would he ask that? It wasn't necessary for his job at all. He could have easily finished what he needed to do and left, but instead, he just kept lingering. My instincts were screaming at me to do something, anything. I didn't know why, but I could feel the tension building in my chest. Every moment felt like I was trapped in a bad situation. That's when it hit me. I didn't want to seem rude, but I also didn't want to be alone with him any longer. I quickly pulled my phone out of my pocket and pretended to receive a call from Mark. "Oh, hey babe," I said loudly, making sure Steve could hear. "Yeah, the guy from the water department is here, but he's acting strange. He's been walking around the house, and I don't know, he's just off. Should I let him keep doing this?" I paused, allowing a fake conversation to unfold. "Okay, well, I'll stay on the phone with you while he's here. Yeah, I'll just stay in the kitchen. No problem." I could hear Steve moving behind me, and when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him stop dead in his tracks. He didn't say a word. His expression froze as if I had just shocked him. His eyes shifted, darting from my face to the door and back again, like he was considering his options. Finally, he nodded, almost as if he had been jolted out of whatever trance he had been in. "All right, ma'am, I'll get going now." He walked toward the door, not saying another word. It was like a switch had flipped in his head, and suddenly he wasn't interested in being there anymore. He left without so much as a goodbye. He didn't even try to make small talk. He just walked out of the door, leaving me standing there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I stared at the door for a few moments, still holding my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. I immediately called Mark, trying to explain what had happened as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking as I told him everything. The strange man, his behavior, how he wouldn't stop staring at me. Mark was just as freaked out as I was. He told me to inform the police and not let anyone else in until he got home. I knew I needed to call the police, so I did. The officer who responded was understanding, but visibly concerned. When I explained everything, he got quiet for a moment. Then he told me something I wasn't prepared for. Apparently, Steve wasn't the first person to pull this scam. There had been similar incidents in the area where a man pretending to be a utility worker would come into people's homes, look for opportunities, and sometimes even attack people when they were alone. The police told me they'd keep an eye out for him, but there was nothing else they could do at the moment. I know I'll never forget how that man looked at me, like he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And I'm just so grateful that I trusted my instincts when I did. Because if I hadn't faked that phone call, who knows what could have happened. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, trust your gut. Don't take any chances. You never know what someone's intentions really are. I had always considered myself to be a pretty rational person. I didn't really believe in any of the usual creepy stuff, ghosts, hauntings, or anything supernatural. To me, all that was just an overactive imagination or people who had too much time on their hands. I'd never been the type to scare easily, but that all changed when I moved to this new house in California. I had just gotten out of a bad relationship and needed a fresh start. So I found this small but charming house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was mine, and I was looking forward to settling in. The house was on a quiet street with palm trees lining the road and small, neat lawns. The whole neighborhood seemed pristine, a little too perfect almost, but in a peaceful, reassuring kind of way. It took me a while to get everything unpacked. I'd spent the first couple of weeks just putting my things in place, trying to make the space feel like home. The whole time, everything seemed to be just normal. It was almost too quiet, but I tried not to think much of it. After all, this was California. The weather was nice, and I didn't have to worry about snowstorms or any of that. But then came the car. At first, it didn't strike me as odd. It was across the street, parked near the curb. Just a regular old sedan, gray, worn out, and dirty from being parked out in the sun. It didn't stand out in any way. I remember thinking that it probably belonged to some older person in the neighborhood, maybe someone who didn't get out much. No big deal, right? But then the next day, I noticed it was still there. And the day after that, still there. I didn't think too much about it, but after a few days, I started to realize that no matter what time of day it was, morning, afternoon, evening, the car was always parked in the same spot. It never moved. The logical part of me told myself it was no big deal, but the more I looked at it, the more it started to bug me. No one ever got in or out of it. No one ever seemed to drive it. It just sat there like it had been abandoned. But then something even stranger started happening. I began to notice a figure sitting in the car. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the figure was there, sitting behind the wheel, the driver's seat occupied by a man, just staring ahead. At least, that's what it looked like from my window. I told myself I was just being paranoid. People in my neighborhood were probably quiet and reserved. But still, something didn't sit right. I could never see his face, only the shadowy outline of him. He never moved, not even when the sun was high in the sky or when the night would fall. He was just there, motionless, like some kind of strange sentinel in the car. The days started to blend together, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time I left the house, I felt this tightness in my chest, a weight that grew heavier each time I glanced across the street. And then every time I came back, the car was still there, the figure still sitting in it, watching. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. It was like the car became a permanent fixture in my life. I couldn't escape it. One afternoon, after work, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I wanted to shake off the unease I was feeling. I didn't plan on walking past the car, but somehow my feet carried me in that direction anyway. As I walked down the sidewalk, I could feel the weight of the car's presence on me, even though I didn't want to look. I could see it in the corner of my eye, the gray sedan, the figure in the driver's seat. But this time, something was different. This time, his head slowly turned toward me. It wasn't a quick motion, it was slow, deliberate. His eyes were locked on me, my heart started to race. I couldn't tear my gaze away. There was something cold, almost predatory in the way he looked at me. It wasn't a casual glance. It was like he was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. I froze in place. I don't even know how long I stood there. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like forever. The man never moved. He just kept staring at me, his expression unreadable, his eyes hollow and dark. My pulse hammered in my throat and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. Finally, I snapped myself out of it and forced my feet to start moving. I kept walking, faster now, my breath shallow. But the image of those eyes stayed with me. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, my mind racing, replaying the moment over and over. What had I seen? Why did it feel so wrong? Why did I feel like I wasn't alone in my own home? The next morning, I made coffee and tried to shake off the feeling. I thought maybe it was just nerves. But then, as I peeked out the window, I saw it. The car was still there, and the man was still sitting in it. But this time, I saw something new. His head wasn't turned toward the front anymore. It was tilted slightly, his eyes fixed on my house. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. So I went outside to get a better look, to see if I could get a glimpse of his face, or at least figure out who he was. As I stepped outside, I felt that familiar chill creep over me. I glanced across the street, but the car was empty. The figure was gone. For a moment, I felt relieved. Maybe I was overreacting after all. But then, as I looked around, I saw him. He was standing on the sidewalk across the street, just staring at me. His face was still hidden in shadow, but I could tell he was looking directly at me. My stomach dropped. I could feel his eyes boring into me like he was measuring me up. Without thinking, I ran back inside and slammed the door shut. I was panicking now. My hands were shaking as I locked the door and pulled the blinds. I felt foolish, but the fear was real. It was like he knew me. Like he'd been watching me for far longer than I even realized. For the next few days, the car remained. I kept an eye on it. I never saw the man get in or out. It was like he was always there, like the car had become his second home. But then things started to escalate. It was a Wednesday night around 9 p.m. when I pulled into my driveway after work. I was tired, just wanting to get inside and relax, when I noticed something that stopped me cold. The car wasn't across the street anymore. It was parked at the end of my driveway, right in front of my house. I remember feeling my breath catch in my throat. I turned off my car and sat there for a moment, just staring at it. The gray sedan, still like it had been there forever. The headlights were off, but I could make out the silhouette of someone sitting inside. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively reached for my phone. I didn't know who to call. 911 seemed too extreme, but I was scared. I had to do something. But before I could make the call, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I looked up and saw him, the man, standing next to my car. He was tall, wearing a long coat that looked out of place in the warm California weather. His face was still hidden in shadow, but I could feel him staring at me. I froze. Then, without a word, he started walking toward my front door. I watched, paralyzed. He stopped at the door and then came the knock. Light at first, almost tentative, but then it came again, harder, more insistent. My heart was pounding in my ears and I had no idea what to do. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher picked up. I could barely hear her over my frantic breathing, but I managed to tell her that someone was at my door, that I was scared. The man continued to knock, then twisted the doorknob, slowly, quietly, as if he were savoring every second of my terror. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, but I didn't make a sound. The seconds dragged on, stretching into minutes. The sirens in the distance were a faint hope on the horizon. I just had to hold out. When the police arrived, I watched through the window as they pulled up. The man quickly turned and bolted for the bushes. They chased him down and arrested him right in front of my house. Later, I found out his name was Greg. He had a history of stalking women in the area. He had been watching me for weeks, learning my habits, my routines. I was just the latest in a long line of women he'd fixated on. When they searched his car, they found a collection of disturbing things, pictures of me, notes with strange, rambling messages. That was the last time I ever saw him. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. I'd never planned on telling anyone this. At first, it seemed too strange, too hard to believe. And then as time went on, I started wondering if I should have taken it more seriously from the beginning. I've been trying to figure out what really happened to me in that house ever since, but I'm still not sure I understand it all. So I guess telling this story is my way of trying to make sense of it. Maybe I'll never truly understand, but I hope someone else can make heads or tails of it. I moved to California about 6 months ago, hoping for a fresh start. I had some personal stuff back home, stuff I didn't really want to get into, and California seemed like the perfect place to escape. A change of scenery, a change of pace, a clean slate. It wasn't easy, of course. Moving to a new state, trying to make friends, find a job, and all that, but I was determined to make it work. I found the house online in one of those foreclosed listings. It was an old 2-story house that had been sitting vacant for months. In pictures, it didn't look like much, certainly not anything luxurious, but it had a certain charm about it. Some parts of the house looked run down, sure, but other parts had a kind of quiet elegance that I couldn't quite explain. The hardwood floors, the tall windows, the way the light filtered through the trees in the backyard, I could see myself in it. The price was incredibly cheap too, so I put in an offer. When I first saw the house in person, I wasn't disappointed. It was exactly as the pictures had shown. The neighborhood was quiet, tucked away in a small corner of California, just far enough from the main city to feel secluded, but still within reach of everything I needed. It was an older neighborhood, but it had a peaceful vibe. The houses were spaced far apart, with big yards, old trees lining the streets, and the occasional house in need of a little TLC. It wasn't a place with a lot of foot traffic, which I liked. Just what I needed to focus on getting settled in. I remember walking through the house for the first time. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, the air smelled of dust and something else, a kind of mustiness that didn't bother me too much. Everything was clean though, and it looked like the previous owners had taken care of the place before they left. The kitchen was outdated, the walls a faded yellowish color, but there was something warm about it. The living room had a fireplace with a mantel that could have looked great with the right decorations. Upstairs, the bedrooms were a bit smaller than I had expected, but cozy. The only thing that caught my attention was the front door. It was a bit old, with chipped paint and the smell of wood polish clinging to it. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured it was the kind of thing that needed to be taken care of after some time. But as I examined, I noticed something strange. The locks. The deadbolt in particular seemed a little too loose. I could turn it a few times without much resistance, and the knob was similarly wobbly. It didn't feel secure. I wasn't exactly paranoid, but I had heard stories about break-ins in the area before I moved in. Nothing major, but enough to make me cautious. So I decided I'd replace the locks. No big deal. I was handy enough for small repairs and I had all the tools I needed. I figured I could knock it out over the weekend and be done with it. Then, one afternoon, I finally decided to get around to replacing the locks. It was just after work. The sun was starting to set, casting a soft, golden light through the windows. I grabbed my tools and headed out to the front door. I figured I'd just pop out the old locks, put in the new ones, and call it a day. Nothing fancy. As I was working, I noticed something else strange. There was a small scratch on the doorframe, right above the doorknob. It wasn't deep, just a shallow line, like something had scraped across it. I hadn't seen it when I first moved in, so I assumed it was probably from when the previous owners had installed the locks. It didn't seem like much, but something about it nagged at me. I figured I was just being jumpy, so I moved on and finished installing the new deadbolt. When I was done, I felt pretty good about it. The door felt sturdier, the locks were tight, and I didn't have to worry about anyone sneaking in. At least I thought I didn't. That night, I settled in for an early evening. It had been a long day, and I was tired from all the work I'd done. I made myself dinner, watched some TV, and then eventually headed to bed. I think I was asleep for a couple of hours when I heard it. A loud bang. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. The sound had come from the front door, and I knew instantly that it wasn't the wind. No way. My mind went straight to the locks. Had I done a bad job? Had I missed something? I was still disoriented from sleep, but I quickly grabbed my phone and pulled myself out of bed. My hands were shaking. I slowly crept down the stairs, trying to stay as quiet as possible. When I reached the door, I stood there for a moment, just listening. I couldn't hear anything, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something didn't feel right. I peered through the peephole, but all I saw was the empty street. The porch light flickered, casting strange shadows across the ground, but there was no one there. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was probably just a car backfiring, or maybe the wind had knocked something against the door. I was being ridiculous, but then it happened again. A soft thud, followed by a subtle rattling sound, as if someone was gently shaking the doorknob. My heart stopped. I could feel my legs go weak, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I stayed there, frozen, my hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. The rattling stopped, and for a moment there was nothing. Silence. The kind of silence that made your skin crawl. Then, just as I was about to breathe again, there was another, much louder bang. The door shook this time. Without thinking, I rushed to the other side of the room, grabbed a chair, and wedged it under the door handle. I couldn't explain it, but the instinct to barricade myself in took over. I pressed my shoulder against the door, holding the chair tight with my hands. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The door rattled again, harder this time. Someone was out there, trying to break in. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, not knowing what to do. I didn't have a weapon, and I was completely alone. My mind raced. I grabbed my phone from my pocket, hands trembling, and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered quickly, and I blurted out the situation. "Someone's trying to break in. They're at my door. I don't know what to do. Please help. Hurry." The dispatcher's voice was calm, but firm. "Stay on the line with me. I need you to find a safe place to hide. Help is on the way. Stay quiet. Don't make any noise." I could hear the urgency in their voice, but all I could do was stand there, heart pounding in my chest. The banging on the door intensified, like someone was throwing themselves against it. I could feel the door groan under the pressure. I backed away, quietly moving into the corner of the living room, pressing myself behind the couch, just as the dispatcher had advised. The only sounds now were the thudding of the door and the faint sound of my own breath. The rattling stopped for a moment. I felt my throat tighten, but I stayed as still as I could. Then, without warning, the door shook violently once more. This time, I felt the impact through the floorboards. Someone was definitely trying to get in, and the police hadn't arrived yet. I heard another thud, this one heavier, and then silence. It felt like hours passed. The world seemed to hold its breath. The police finally arrived a few minutes later, sirens blaring in the distance. I rushed to the door, still clutching my phone, and unlocked it to let them in. The officers swarmed in, weapons drawn, but by the time they reached the porch, there was no one there. They searched the yard, the street, the entire area, but nothing. No sign of anyone. Just the remnants of the pounding on the door. They told me it might have been someone playing a prank or just a random person trying to mess with me. They never found out who it was. There were no fingerprints, no solid clues, but I never felt safe in that house again. I stayed for another week, but every night I could still hear those footsteps. I could still feel the pounding on the door. Even after I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, that they still were. I don't know who it was, but I couldn't take the chance. So I left, and I never looked back. But to this day, I can't stop wondering, who was trying to get in, and why? That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the Vault awaits your return.